everyone. I'm Brad Bough, along with my co-host, Lee Hutchinson, with our special guest for this Indiana History Project, Lieutenant Colonel Ray Kern, United States Air Force retired. It was as natural for Colonel Kern to be flying aircraft as it was for Ken Griffey Jr. to be playing baseball. He literally cut his teeth in aircraft, and we'll get into that story as we go along. Colonel Kern, you were born here in Bedford, correct?
Right.
Yes. And who was the very first passenger on your father's, your very first ride on an aircraft? You were the first passenger for your father, is that correct?
He was in the Navy, and when the war ended, he was just shipping across the Atlantic to go to war, and they turned his ship around and brought him back. So he spent a few years decommissioning ships and then got out of the Navy, married my mom in Florida, brought her back to Indiana, used his GI Bill to learn how to fly, right out here at the Bedford Airport. And he tells me I was his first passenger, and I was 3 or 4 months old, a few months old. I don't remember the first ride, of course, but he tells me that after he got his pilot's license and was legal to fly a passenger, and I flew with him from the local Bedford Airport all the time then, from then on, because that was his favorite hobby. He'd rather be flying than boating or about anything.
Now, did you graduate from Bedford High School, is that correct?
I did.
Okay. What year did you graduate, sir?
1965.
1965. And from there you went to Indiana University, is that correct? And what did you study at Indiana University?
Well, I won a merit scholarship for mathematics, and so IU was the free school to go to with my scholarship. So I went to IU and studied mathematics for a couple of years. I didn't really want that to be my major because that's kind of difficult, and you can't really see the uses of that unless you're going to be a full-time scientist of some sort. I wanted to study religion and philosophy, and I took all the religion courses they had at IU and all of the philosophy and psychology stuff the first couple of years. And then by that time I was in theoretical algebra, past calculus and trig and all of that stuff, and mathematics had kind of played out for me. It was getting real difficult and not very interesting because you can't see where that mathematics is going to go unless you're really a scientist. And so I decided I'd go to med school and become a doctor. Why not? And they make lots of money. And I got a degree in human physiology and started off to med school, and cutting cadavers and stuff right there my senior year at IU kind of turned me off with that profession. I didn't enjoy it as much as I thought I might. The Air Force offered me a job flying airplanes. It was either go to med school, get drafted, or join something. And the Air Force said if I'd join, they'd send me to pilot school for sure. And I took all the exams, and they said, yes, I qualified, you can go. I said, well, that sounds good. I get paid to go learn to fly airplanes and get my ratings. And so I did that. In 1970, I went into the Air Force full time. I went to officers training school down in San Antonio for 3 or 4 months, and they made a second lieutenant out of me at that time. And then off to pilot training for a year. Pilot training takes about a year in the Air Force.
So human physiology doesn't really have anything to do with flying jet aircraft, but again, here we go. It is the degree that matters. So for the young people listening out there, if you want to do something exciting like what Colonel Kern did, you have to get that degree. So Colonel Kern, after you completed pilot's training, where did you go after that?
Well, at the end of pilot training, they offered 10% of the class the opportunity to come back as an instructor pilot. And guys were fighting for those Vietnam shoot up the scenery slots out of my pilot training class because Vietnam was still hot and heavy. And that didn't look that appealing to me. Flying airplanes in Arizona and teaching guys to fly looked like a good deal to me. So I opted for an instructor pilot slot. I went back and flew T-37s in Phoenix, Arizona, and taught guys to fly for the next 3 years right there in Phoenix.
So you weren't looking at the command time as a combat pilot, you were looking at the command time as a training pilot.
Right.
Okay.
Right.
And that's an honorable pursuit because these young men that went to Vietnam, they had to learn from you, and that's another position that we need to have is experienced pilots training those that are going into combat.
Right.
Now, when you finished there, or while you were there in Arizona, what type of aircraft were you training these pilots that were shipping off to Vietnam?
Primarily the T-37s. We had two types. You'd spend half a year in a T-37, which was a little Cessna jet. I think she's got a picture of that, one of our first pictures. That's the bag that I would always carry going,
okay, your flight bag?
going in every day. I'd take this bag and this helmet and put on my parachute and walk out to the plane.
Yeah, now the T-37, as I recall, had a variant, which was an attack variant of the T-37 known as the A-37 Dragonfly.
Right.
And that was used a lot in Vietnam as well. So
Right.
you training the younger pilots in this particular aircraft is nothing extraordinary. It was actually used quite extensively in Vietnam.
Right. I, later in my career, moved to Grissom Air Force Base up here in northern Indiana as a reserve officer to fly A-37s. And that developed on past that. But the basic pilot training was half a year in T-37s and then half a year in T-38s. And the T-38s were the supersonic, the Talon. And so everybody that learned to fly in the Air Force would get a little bit of experience in both of those planes.
And, well, here we go again. The T-38, the variant of that was F-5 Tiger Shark, was it not?
Right.
And they used that in Vietnam as well.
Not much,
Not-
but we
not
sold
much?
those to a
Okay.
lot of other countries.
All right, so
That was
we-
real light plane,
Yes.
and our Air Force went for heavier fighters. But the smaller countries in Europe loved that F-5, and they bought a lot of them. And we taught a lot of their students to fly. One of my jobs as a T-37 instructor was teaching Iranian students to fly their F-14s that they were going to fly when they went back to Iran. We were teaching Nigerian students to fly their planes that they were buying from the United States and flying in their air forces. Several different nationalities came through my pilot training class in Phoenix.
When we sold planes, we had to train the pilots to fly the planes.
Sure, running a pilot training class, a base to do that is horribly expensive. Most countries can't do it. And we've got 5 or 6 of those bases. And so I was at the biggest one of those in Phoenix.
They didn't need the planes unless they had the pilots.
No use for them, right?
Was the A-37 a fighter plane, or was it a...
The A-37 is a fighter plane.
Okay.
It had the same engines as a T-38. They had J-69s.
I see.
And so it would carry more weight, go a little bit faster. T-37 had more fuel-efficient engines, and we could spend more hours training people to fly it
Okay.
a little more economically.
Now, my years in the Air Force, the T-38 Talon, that was used by the Air Force Thunderbirds as part of the Air Force aerial demonstration team that was around at that time. Did you have any opportunity to train with or train any of those pilots that were in the Thunderbird program?
Well, that's kind of an interesting story. I flew T-38s, of course, and we would teach guys to fly the aerial combat maneuvers, to do the loops and the rolls and the cubinates and all of the different maneuvers that the Thunderbirds did. We would teach everybody to do that in order to make them a pilot in the first place. And when they'd get their wings at the end of that 1 year, they knew how to do all of that stuff. So I was familiar with those planes. After my 3 years in Phoenix, I went to Peterson Air Force Base in Colorado Springs. The Air Force discovered that it had a bunch of pilots that had graduate degrees that were going to teach at the academy. They'd teach physics or history or psychology with a PhD in psychology, and they were teaching at the academy, but they were also pilots. And they were losing their proficiency while they were doing that tour. So I was offered the opportunity to go to Colorado Springs and start a pilot training squadron, and to keep those pilots, who were then academy professors, proficient in flying. So I set up a pilot training squadron in Colorado Springs, right across the road from the Air Force Academy, and taught the Air Force pilots there for 3 years. And in that process, right towards the end of that 3 years, they had an opening in Thunderbirds that I put together a package for and applied for. And at that point in time, I had 1,000 hours in that particular airplane. I was the right age, I had the right experience, and I thought that would be a fun thing to do. I put that package all together, put it in. I was 8 years into the Air Force at that point in time and thinking about maybe doing something as a civilian, so I put in my package to Indiana University Law School, asking them if they wanted me to be a student at Indiana University, and that acceptance came back before my Thunderbird acceptance came back. And I thought, well, I might get accepted into the Thunderbirds, but for sure I could go to law school right here in Bedford, which was appealing to me because I'm an old Bedford boy. My father grew up in Bedford, his father grew up in Bedford, his father grew up in Bedford. We're Lawrence County people, and I wanted to come back to Bedford. So I accepted the law school, got out of the active duty, and didn't ever get to go fly for the Thunderbirds. I don't know if I'd have been picked as one of the finalists, but I had a package in, and I thought I had a good shot at maybe being a Thunderbird pilot.
With enough hours in that particular aircraft, absolutely, without question, you would have been highly considered. I believe we have a picture of the A-37 up on the screen now.
Those are T-37s.
T-37s,
The
okay.
A-37s have tip tanks on the wings and usually hard points underneath to strap bombs and stuff.
Okay.
This is what I taught in.
All right.
I'd teach guys to fly the four-ship formations like that, and we'd go out and we'd do loops and rolls and everything that the Thunderbirds do. We'd do it at high level. We wouldn't do it right close to the ground like they did, but we would do that in those planes and teach guys how to do it.
Okay. We have a picture here now from Lee Hutchinson, and it is of the German jet that was used during World War II. Lee, you want to comment on this jet? It's one of the first jets.
Well, since we're talking about jets today, and we have a modern jet pilot here today, we need to go back in history. This was the first jet. The German Air Force in World War II developed the first jets. They had a single-engine jet called the Comet, which carried, I'm more interested in the armament, but they carried two 30-millimeter cannons on them when they came after us. But that first jet, that single-engine jet, tended to explode when they landed. They had propellant fluid, and if they didn't use up all their fluid, that thing might explode when they hit the ground, and if it was a rough landing. Now this was a Messerschmitt 262 twin-engine jet.
And that's
just about like
this one right here.
Yeah, just about right in a rocket. They're attacking the B-17. This artist, Gromowski, did hundreds of paintings. He gave me that one at the Indianapolis Air Show, and I've kept it as a souvenir because it's very realistic. They personally, on our 14th mission, they came into we were attacked by the ME-262s, and they were so fast that you just see a blur go past you. But the ME-262s had 4 cannons in the nose, and so they could come in and wreak havoc on a bomber formation. The one that I remember especially, the one we were attacked by, I remember that one. But 68 years ago this very day, April the 19th, a formation of our 490th bombers went over Czechoslovakia and they were attacked. I wasn't on that mission. We flew the day before and the day after, but on that particular mission, the formations were attacked by 3 of these 262s. And they were so deadly that in less than 4 minutes, they shot down 4 bombers. Either shot them down or crippled them until they had to bail out. And the reason, more significantly, our ex-ball turret gunner was flying on one of those planes that was shot down. And so 10 men bailed out and landed in a German SS training camp. It was 11 days before the war ended, before the ceasefire. But those SS troops interrogated they shot one man as soon as he landed. One man escaped and his chute carried him over further, but they captured 8 immediately, interrogated him, and that night they shot him and buried him in a mass grave. Now, of course, the Czechoslovakian people had been occupied by the Germans, and so immediately our troops came in. The Czechs told them exactly where the mass grave was, and these fellows were all exhumed. Some are buried in Arlington Cemetery. My buddy is buried in the Ardennes Cemetery in Belgium, and you can look up his grave number and the plot number and et cetera. We trained together for probably 3 months before he got taken off our crew. So 68 years ago, Wilbur Lesh perished. They were murdered, actually. They were actually murdered. And today, if you go to Bensenov, Czechoslovakia, there's a marker with the names of these men listed on it. I've talked to 2 sons of the men who were killed. I never knew their father, and interviewed 2 nephews. So it's kind of close that you get back to it. And one brother also contacted me. So, you know, when you write history, sometimes things come back to you. It's very rewarding. So that was the very first jet. And that was the start of, we actually brought German engineers to America to develop jet engines at Huntsville, Alabama.
And there's another picture up here on the screen, Lee, if you'd like to comment on that jet.
I think that photo is from the Dayton Air Museum over in Dayton, Ohio. They look a lot scarier than that when they're coming at you.
Well, I'm sure.
And there's another one.
Another likeness. I'm sure the flames coming out of the nose of that aircraft were something to really.
Well, yeah, we filled the sky with machine gun. Our machine gunners filled the sky with tracer bullets, and they were coming in at you, of course. And our P-51s were slower, but they soon learned that these jets were so fast that they were hard to maneuver. And so our P-51s learned to get in behind them, and it took that jet so long to do a loop, you know, that our plane could loop shorter and get in behind them, shoot some down. I've actually met a ME-262 pilot. He and his daughter were touring. They had come to America after the war, and they were touring, and they had written a book, and so they had about 200 of them that actually flew. If they'd have had more, the war would have ended differently.
He's talking about they were filling the sky with 50 caliber bullets from his B-17s.
Right.
Okay, that's what they were shooting, lots of them. Each one of his machine guns would shoot 700 rounds a minute, and he had 15
13 to 14, yeah.
machine guns on each B-17
Yes.
that he was shooting. So he's filling the sky with these. But the 4 30 millimeter shells that were coming back were shooting like 40 or 50 per minute of 30 millimeter, or 30 caliber. It's 30 millimeter. This is 50 caliber, and this is 30 millimeter. So this is the size shells that they were shooting back.
Right.
Okay. Actually, I brought this bullet because that's the type of bullet that the A-10 shoots out of its cannon. And a modern cannon will shoot 4,200 rounds of this per minute instead of like 50 rounds per minute out of the cannons that were coming in Germany.
And the B-17 was named the Super Fortress, wasn't it, Lee?
Colonel George said, today's plane, one plane can do what our whole formation did.
Right.
Oh, yeah, yeah, the
As
general.
far as pulling out bullets.
Yeah, the general was very clear on that point, wasn't
Yes, he was.
Yes. These 50 calibers that were used during World War II led to the name of the Super Fortress for the B-17. Is that correct, Lee? Because of all the armament on that aircraft?
Yeah, the Super Fortress was
Yes.
just a bigger B-17.
Okay.
And B-17 pilots, during World War II, the pilots, you were talking about pilot training, what you did. And there were many, many pilots that came over there who had maybe trained in a B-24 bomber and were switched to B-17s. And the guy said, you learn to fly it on the way to the target.
Yeah.
You know, the training was very, very rapid. And I thought yours was so thorough. Today it's so thorough, and we eliminate all the guys that have problems or can't
Well,
make.
we built something like 10,000 B-17s.
Mm-hmm.
We built 22 B-2s, and we only have 21 of them left. Of course, one of them was destroyed, and one of them's not in service right now. So we only have 20 operative B-2s. You have to have your very best pilots flying well-trained and well-coordinated missions because you want every one of those to come back and go again. We lost half of them, half of the 10,000.
Yeah, it was a terrific number we lost. And I mean, you go up the 100th Bomb Group I'm writing about now, But they would go out and maybe lose 12 planes out of 30.
And that's 10 people per plane
And,
as
yeah,
a
that's
crew. So you're losing 120 people on a mission.
26,000 airmen died, and I don't know how many were wounded and et cetera, but then POWs. And many times you get shot down and you'd end up being in a prisoner of war camp, and many of those guys survived and came home. And it was a different war. I mean, a slow motion war compared to today.
Slow motion of what's going to happen if it goes again, yeah.
Now, Colonel, going back to your jet training, this helmet looks interesting to me. Would you care to explain to the viewers how you would wear that helmet, sir?
Well, the fighter pilots always wear a mask for the oxygen. So the microphone is in there. You've got a button you can push anytime you want to talk to anybody. You're talking on the intercom all the time if you've got a backseater, if you've got a two-person fighter. And you're getting your oxygen through here. The modern fighters are pressurized, but often you get a bullet through that takes care of your pressurization on your fighter, so you have to have the oxygen right to your face too to take care of that. If you are flying low and you're worried about birds hitting you, you've got a clear shield. If you're flying in bright sunlight, you just put down your sunshade. And these helmets are made to pretty well make things quieter, give you a little bit of safety from bumping your head around, and to give you the mask and the oxygen and the vision.
Okay.
So I'd wear this every day. I'd carry it out to the plane, and that was part of, this was the outfit that I lived in for 8 years active duty, and then 22 years in the reserve after that, when I started flying up at Grissom and flew the different planes that we flew up there.
Okay. Now, comparing the various aircraft that you've flown, which one is your favorite, sir?
My favorite. I probably liked that T-38 about the best. It's fairly simple to fly. It was made to teach people to fly, so it was kept fairly simple. It's supersonic. It'll go almost Mach 2. It'll fly 50,000 feet, and it's just kind of a fun little sports car to fly. Arthur Godfrey bought one when they first came out and started selling them to the Air Force. He was big on the radio and then had just started in TV and had lots of money. He bought one for his personal. Northrop sold him a T-38, and he flew it. He and his pilot flew it all over the country for several years. And
Wasn't he a naval officer, I believe, Arthur Godfrey?
I don't know.
Yeah, I know Jimmy Stewart was a brigadier general in the Air Force.
Yeah, I knew that.
Yeah. So a lot of famous people have been military heroes in and of their own right. Jimmy Stewart actually flew combat missions in World War II.
B-24s.
Yeah. He wasn't a Hollywood actor that they just brought in for a talking head. He actually walked the walk and talked the talk.
Yeah.
Now, when you completed your missions or your training mission with the T-38s and the T-37s, where did you go from there?
Well, when I got off of active duty and went back to law school, I was going to treat law school like an 8-to-5 job, and I was going to be in the reserves also on the weekends. And law school didn't turn out to really be an 8-to-5 job. They handed me this set of books, and they said, okay, now we're going to go through those first chapters in each one of those books Monday morning. I went, whoa, I don't read that fast. So law school turned into a 12, 14-hour-a-day job, but I managed to get into the reserves at Grissom. They were flying A-37s at that time, and so I had lots of experience in the T-37s. Shortly after I got into the unit and was checking out in the A-37s, they switched over to A-10s, which is the more modern ground support. A-37 is a ground support attack aircraft. That's what the A stands for. The A-10 is the replacement of that. It's for killing tanks and killing big anti-artillery, anti-aircraft artillery and stuff on the ground. Close air support, the A, rather than an F for a fighter, or a T for a trainer, or a C for a cargo aircraft, B for bomber. So A-37, we switched to the A-10s and flew them for a while up there at Grissom. Later, they switched to a KC-135 and started flying tankers.
Yes.
And I started in on that, and about that time, our JAG officer, who was Judge Sharp, a federal judge in the Northern District, was also our reserve unit Judge Advocate General. He was the lawyer for the group. And I had been a judge here in Lawrence County for about 5 or 6 years at that point in time, and he retired. And they needed a new JAG officer for the wing, a lawyer to advise the commander on legal stuff. And they asked me to do that. So I switched over to the JAG Corps. My last 10 years in the Air Force Reserve, I was a JAG officer. And I deployed with the unit. Every year we would go do 3 or 4 weeks in Operation Deny Flight or Operation whatever it was called that year. We'd go to Italy or France or Germany, wherever was needed at that particular year. And the guys were flying the KC-135s most of that time, but I'd go as the JAG officer, and I'd talk my way into the cockpit and get to fly with them a little bit, but mostly I was keeping the legal part straight.
I might butt in here. When you're flying a jet, is it true that if you fire the bullet, you have to veer to keep from shooting yourself down? Can you catch up with the bullet?
That used to be true. No, not really.
No, you don't have to veer
No,
off.
these are supposed to have a flat trajectory 2 miles out there.
Okay.
And so they come out real fast. They come out like 70 bullets per second out of the 7 barrels in your Gatling gun. And they come out and they go supersonic. So if you're on the ground,
Supersonic, okay.
you hear it go brr, 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 and that's the bullets coming out, going supersonic, and then hitting the target.
So you didn't have to worry about...
The 837 won't go supersonic.
Okay.
So you're coming in at 400, 425 knots, and then these are going to come out and go over 1,000 miles per hour, miles per hour. You're not going to catch them in an A37. And just,
When you would hear an A-10 in Afghanistan, it just sounded like a protracted belch to me.
Is that it?
Yeah. Yeah, just burp.
and he's trying for a 2 or 3 second burst there, 140, 200
And
shells.
that's exactly how it is, burp, and you knew
Okay.
they were out there doing their job.
Question number 2, G-forces. What is a G-force?
We've got 1 G, gravity, force of gravity pulling on us right now. If I roll into a 60-degree bank turn and hold level flight, then I've not only got the force of gravity pulling me to the earth, but I've got the gravity pulling me sideways as I make the turn. So it feels like I'm being pulled into that seat twice as hard. So I've got 2 Gs holding a level 60-degree bank turn. Okay, if I want to climb real fast, I pull the stick back, I can pull 3, 4, 5. F-16 can pull 9 Gs. If you don't have special equipment to help you with that,
Now you're in the third question.
Yeah.
You had to have pressure suits.
you can withstand 3, 4, 5 Gs.
Okay.
But much more than that for any length of time at all, and all the blood just goes out of your head and you can't think. So you let go at that point, and if you've got enough altitude, you come back awake and then everything's okay. They've got systems built into the modern fighters like the F-15s, 16s, 22s now that will ground recover. If you black out and you're headed down at the ground like that, it'll at least recover it back to level flight for you so you can wake up and go on again.
There was an F-22 at the air show a couple of years ago.
Aren't those fabulous?
And he could do anything, straight up, and he just let it fall. And I interviewed him, and he was a little Latino, about 30 years old, as sharp as a tack, bright-eyed. Says, I'm sitting up there with multi-million-dollar equipment all by myself.
Yeah.
He was very proud.
F-22 is the best fighter in the world right now. It's more maneuverable, faster.
It was amazing.
The T-38 that I was talking about being fun.
Yeah, we have another picture of one
Okay,
up there,
that's
yes?
a T-38. You asked me what my favorite is. That's probably my favorite. That's the first airplane that could accelerate going straight up. It set a world time to climb record. You sitting still on the runway, taking off and going 50,000 feet, and it did that in 45 seconds. So then the F-15 came along with half again as much horsepower and beat that record. But for several years, this was the fastest climbing airplane in the world. It would go from sitting on the ground to high real fast.
Now this is is that the T-33, sir?
That was the first operational jet the U.S. Air Force had. This was a German, the 262.
Yes, sir.
The T-33 was our answer to start making jet airplanes. I flew those when I was at Colorado Springs. I was in Air Defense Command, and I was teaching the professors to fly, but one of my additional duties was we would take the T-33s and we would go way out in the middle of nowhere, out over the ocean, one of the other oceans, and way up north, almost to the Arctic Circle, and we'd come back into the United States, and we'd see how long it took Air Defense Command to identify us and have an F-106 up there to shoot us down if we happened to be an enemy. And so we were testing them all the time. Every now and then, I'd take a weekend and I'd go to Bangor, Maine, and we'd fly 3 or 4 missions testing the ADIS and seeing how fast Air Defense Command could have a plane up there to shoot me down if I was an enemy.
Now you mentioned the F-106. Do you recall the?
They call that the Delta Dart.
Okay, that's what I thought. Delta Dart.
And they were interceptors. They were
Yes, for NORAD.
for NORAD. NORAD is the North American Air Defense Command. That is the big organization that I worked for there in Colorado Springs.
Cheyenne Mountain.
Cheyenne Mountain Complex, NORAD. But Air Defense Command was the American component of NORAD. And then Canada was also part of NORAD. Okay, so North American Defense Command was the big operating unit. Air Defense Command was my Air Force command that worked for NORAD, right there at the Cheyenne Mountain Complex here in Colorado Springs.
Did Peterson Air Force Base exist at that time then?
Yes, that's where I lived. I lived
Okay.
right on Peterson
All
Air
right.
Force Base. And
I recall about Peterson. It's Space Command headquarters now, I believe, isn't it?
it is.
Okay. I've got some personal pictures here, Colonel. Do these mean anything to you?
When I came back to Indiana and started going to law school, I joined the 434th Tactical Fighter Wing with the A-10 up there on the license plate there in the middle.
Yes, sir.
So I wore that on the front of my car for a while. And then in 1992, the Indiana State Legislature finally got a bill through that said Air Force Reserve people, Army Reserve people, Navy Reserve people could have the specialized license plates that they were just creating back then about 10 years ago, about 20 years ago now. And I helped do the paperwork to get that bill through. So I got Air Force number 4 license plate to wear on my car for a year. And I was real proud of that.
Are these the A-10 Warthogs here,
That's
sir?
the A-10. That's the tank buster. You can see right in the nose is the Gatling gun that will shoot these shells at 70 a second. And then underneath it, it's got hard points. You can put 16,000 pounds worth of bombs, missiles, electronic jamming equipment underneath that plane and go carry out missions of just about anything you can dream up. It can carry about any ordnance that can be carried. And there's a guy shooting the gun. You can see the smoke out of the Gatling gun that's shooting those bullets kind of surrounding the plane.
It reminds me of the Civil War where the cannon fire would put out so much smoke that the artillery officers couldn't see where it was going. Is that pretty much the fact with that aircraft too, sir?
Well, you're going pretty fast. He's doing about 425, and you can see him in the cockpit pretty easily.
Right.
And most of the smoke's going out and around him. It would sometimes get a little bit in the engines, but it never really would block my gun sight.
Okay. Did the smoke coming through the engines ever affect your air system inside the cockpit or anything like that?
Not very badly,
Not
no,
very
because you're
bad?
doing it for a real short time. 140 shells, and you're only carrying a couple of thousand to start with, so you never really just hold it for very long. So that smoke doesn't last very long.
You don't burn out the barrels either.
You don't burn out the barrels. It's spinning. Each one of them's only doing 10 rounds a minute, or second.
And with that size of shell, it doesn't take very many of them to destroy an enemy tank.
We usually loaded up the ammo bay with, every 10th one of these was a tracer, so you could see where the bullets were going. Every 10th one was a high explosive. So if you're shooting at a bunch of tanks, it killed all the people that were around, the guys with the rifles. And then the other 8 were depleted uranium, which makes them denser than lead. And when these hit, they've got enough kinetic force to go right through any tank. The best tanks in the world, this bullet would just go right through them and bounce around inside and set things on fire. And so 8 of the 10 depleted uraniums, and then a high explosive and tracer, then start all over again.
Now, what size is that again?
This is 30 millimeter.
Okay, 30 millimeter. Okay.
And this is 50 caliber,
Yeah,
which is
that's
half an inch. It just,
We had tons of those.
yeah. This was a big gun in
That
World
was a
War
big
II.
gun, yeah.
If you had
And you couldn't burn out the barrel. You had to, when we made lead crew, they put the co-pilot in the tail as a tail gunner and command fire officer. And they put the command pilot up next to as co-pilot. Well, our second lieutenant co-pilot, when we got hit by a fighter, first thing he did was burn out the barrel. He froze on the trigger, burn out the barrel. So we rode him about that for the rest of the tour.
He deserved it. Yeah.
He deserved it.
Here we have a refueling mission of some type. Is that one of the aircraft out of Grissom, sir?
Yes, that's a KC-135, and that's what we currently use to refuel all over the world. We've got those planes flying all over the Middle East, refueling, people going into Afghanistan, refueling.
And what type of aircraft is that it's refueling, sir? Is it
That's an F-15.
F-15? Okay.
How'd the 15 and the 16 compare?
The F-15's got twice as many engines, can carry a lot more weight,
Oh, I see.
and usually carries 2 people. The F-16 is about half of that. It's got one. F-16 is a brilliant fighter. It's not as capable as F-15.
No.
It's just, but it's a lot less
We had
expensive.
F-16s at Terre Haute.
We
They
did.
moved them to Fort Wayne.
Yeah.
Have they moved them out of Fort Wayne yet?
I think they're still in
They're
Fort
still
Wayne.
Fort Wayne. Fort Wayne's kind of a fond place for maybe. That's where I got my discharge.
From Fort Wayne?
Yeah, Fort Wayne Bear Field.
That's neat.
Okay. And is this a family picture, sir, of your children?
I thought you might like to see that. That's my son on the left, my daughter in the middle, and my son-in-law on the right. And
Yep.
this was a few years ago. My son is flying Chinook aircraft out of the Army. And my daughter is full-time Air Force. She's an optometrist and takes care of people's eyes on the Air Force Base, but she's now currently married to a guy flying those tankers that we just saw. And my son has just gotten engaged to another helicopter pilot. So I've got lots of military contacts. I can hear what's going on in the local military. My son spent 2 years in Afghanistan and is currently, there's the day, I don't know if that's on the air or not, but that's the day he got his wings pinned on him as an Army helicopter pilot and flying Chinooks, the great big 2-rotor helicopters. And he flew, there's the Chinook that he flew into Afghanistan for a couple of years and delivered lots of the special forces, like the people that would go after Osama bin Laden. One of those went over and brought most of that crew back. They didn't go in with those because they're a little bit noisy. But once they got in there, they brought them back with these.
We had a Chinook land at the airfield Wednesday.
Did it?
Yeah, came right over there, Otis Park.
Kind of noisy, aren't they?
Right over Otis Park, came right down. I don't know what he was doing out there, but he was a monster.
Yeah, those Chinooks can carry a lot of cargo. They can even strap even a Humvee underneath their belly, and they'll sling load them, and you'll see them
They can
flying
put 2
across.
Humvees together and tie them up and take them off.
I haven't saw 2. I saw one in Afghanistan.
I've watched
where
them
they
take
fly
2
them, yeah.
before.
That's amazing.
My son tells me about during the year he was in Honduras, helping to pull people out of landslide, the villages that would get, a hurricane would come by and the village would get decimated or something, he's trying to evacuate. He'd put 105 villagers in the back, they're little people, but in the back of his plane and fly them off to safety and then come back and get another 100.
He was one of them that flew the humanitarian missions during, it was Hurricane Mitch.
Yes.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I recall that.
He did a lot of that down in
Well,
Honduras.
that's wonderful, because so often, you know, the bad Americans and everything like that, when we do something like that, it shows that Americans care for other people as well.
Sure.
And it's good that we do that. Is this another type of aircraft you flew, sir?
Well, you said that I could talk about flying, so this is the kind of flying that I have always done and gotten paid for. Nowadays, the only flying I get paid for is when I teach people to fly in my little Tomahawk. This is a Piper Tomahawk. It's only got 2 seats, and I teach people to fly at the local Bedford Airport. If you want to come out and get your private license, I get people their licenses all the time, and solo you out, let you go by yourself for a little while and get a flight check so you can fly other people. And that's my gyrocopter that I also give flight instruction in. That one will fly a lot slower, and it's a little bit more fun at close-in things, but if you're trying to get a private license to be able to go fly the bigger planes, and you want to do that in the little white plane. This is my nowadays flying.
Okay. So you're also a civilian instructor as well.
Yeah, I'm retired now from being a lawyer and a judge, and retired from the Air Force, and about my only productive work, the only thing I really get paid for anymore is teaching people to fly.
Okay, I went out and visited with the Pilots Association that meets Thursday at the airport. I went out there when I first took my job as a veteran service officer here in the county and met with a lot of those fellas, and almost to a man, they're all military veterans. Now, we see a flight crew checklist here. You want to explain what that book's about, sir, and why it's important that you as a pilot go through that?
Well, you grab your helmet, you're wearing your flight suit, and you got your parachute on your back. The other thing you always have with you is your flight crew checklist. So the important things while you're flying are in here. I've got the approach. If I get into the weather at Bedford and have to make an instrument approach, this is the procedure. If I have to go to Bloomington, there's the Bloomington procedure. If I have to file for an alternate airport, these are the power settings I'm going to use, and it tells me how far I'm going to get with how much fuel I've got. It's just the specifics of the airplane that I'm flying and the mission that I'm on, and it always just straps right to my leg, so it's right here handy. It doesn't get away. And in the middle of flying, sometimes it gets hectic, so you want the important data right here on your leg. And so this lived with me. These were part of my body for the last 40 years, 50 years.
Is runway 31 your best approach into Bedford, or is there another runway that you would recommend, sir?
13 and 31 are the same piece of concrete.
Yes, sir.
Just going at different ends. They're both good.
They're both good?
Both the same piece of concrete, so.
All right.
If the wind's blowing out of the north, I land on runway 31. If the wind's blowing out of the south, I land on 13.
And like at Grissom, it's runway 5, runway 23, it's same piece of concrete, it's just different ends of the runway.
Right.
Could you explain that to the viewers, how they determine that?
Well, the compass rose has 360 degrees on it. So north is 0 or 360. Well, I guess going around to the east, it's 90 degrees, 180 degrees, 270 degrees, back to 0 at 360. The runway headings are which way the runway is heading according to magnetic north. So runway 31 is heading 310 degrees on the compass heading. And actually that slowly changes as magnetic north changes. So it's usually a degree or two off on any airport that's had a runway over 15 or 20 years. But
So is that why you'll get the instruction continue with a visual approach or something such as that when you have the airport in sight, as they say?
well, if you're doing an instrument approach, you can do that even if the clouds go clear down to where you can't see until you're just ready to touch down. If it's pretty weather and you're just out there flying around looking at the scenery, you often get a visual approach. It says, yeah, when you have the airport in sight, continue with your visual approach, and they stop giving you instrument instructions. They don't give you headings anymore. They don't give you altitudes anymore. They just let you go fly to the airport and land. When we start flying, when you go after your private license, we're going to start with visual.
When I go after my private license.
We're going to start with visual.
Visual.
And we're going to do all of that without the instruments, looking at the panel mainly. We'll look at it for airspeed and altitude, but we won't do our navigation by the instruments to start with. We'll just look at the ground and we'll we'll go to the airport that way.
You know, on my simulator, I can land the Boeing just fine, but I have a fit with the Airbus, so perhaps you can help me out with my Airbus simulator to start with, sir.
In instructions, if, not me, but if a guy comes out and wants to fly, you got insurance on the plane, and he has to fly, and he has to sign a waiver or something?
Oh, I seldom make anybody sign a waiver,
Okay.
no.
They-
I've seen guys do that, but the waivers, as a lawyer, I know how much those waivers are worth.
Yeah.
So I don't fool
So
with them.
actually, you can take any student, and without much ado, you can start flying lessons.
I've soloed people for their first time in an airplane by themselves from the age of 16 to the age of 79. Larry Benham, Lawrence Benham, the local doctor, soloed for his first time when he was 79 years old. And yeah, so anywhere between those two ages, I can do that.
Well, see, I missed it. I'm 87.
I'll give it a try. You want to go try it?
No.
Well, Lee, we'll let
I've
you
flown
operate the radio.
I've flown on the B-17 3 times in the last 4 or 5 years. And the last one I flew on, had to crash land over in Illinois at
boy.
Liberty Bell. I was up there waiting to fly it that day.
Do
So
you go
I
back
kind of lost interest.
you go back and fly in your old radio operator seat when you get on those
Yeah,
radios?
I always get that. They give me a free, when the Liberty Bell or the Memphis Bell comes in, they'll give me a free ride. They give Air Force veterans a free ride because they want us there for the media day, for interviews and picture photos and et cetera. So it's a publicity deal. And so we go up, the weekend they fly, we go that Friday and get the free ride. And
Pretty neat.
it works out real well.
Now, you were talking about weather situations. I was watching FlightAware yesterday, monitoring the weather as it was coming towards us on FlightAware, and I know that that's not a accredited site for weather, but I enjoy watching that because when I start seeing the aircraft divert around certain thunder cells and so on, I know that that's not good when the aircraft are going around it instead of through it.
Some of those big thunder cells have big enough wind shears in them to just break planes apart. So even like a Boeing 707 or something like that, you don't fly directly through that unless you just had to. We were always told never unless we've just gone to war. And then all bets are off and you go fly your F-106 wherever you have to go to fight the war.
Okay, because yesterday, like I said, I was watching that and I was just amazed at how many aircraft there were in the sky over southern Indiana because of the way the weather was moving out of Missouri and across Illinois, and it was diverting the planes more across Indiana, I suppose. Would that be a typical situation when you have a line of thunderstorms such as we had yesterday, sir?
Well, diverting around the thunderstorms is pretty typical, yeah. They're pretty good about, and the planes are flying so much faster than the thunderstorms are now, so you can usually divert around them. If I want to go from Bloomington to Oklahoma and there's thunderstorms in the middle, you know, if I make a couple 100 miles diversion around to the south, it adds an hour to my trip. It's not a big deal. And I miss the thunderstorm by 100 miles. And so that's the way I do it.
What is the range of your Piper, your little car?
I don't know if this picture is on the screen or not, but this is my twin engine plane that I take trips in.
Oh, okay.
And that plane will do 1,000 miles.
1,000 miles, okay.
It goes at about 200 miles an hour, so it takes 5 hours to go 1,000 miles. We flew it to Oklahoma City last month, and it took about 4 hours and 10 minutes or so.
And what type of aircraft is that, sir?
That's a Piper Aztec.
Piper Aztec.
That'll hold 6 people. And that's the only one that my wife likes to fly in. She wants to go somewhere when she flies. She doesn't want to just go out and look at scenery and play around.
I believe Graham Hill bought a Piper Aztec with his winnings from the 1966 Indy 500. I do believe that was
That'd
the
be
case.
about right. This is a 1969 model.
Okay.
So it'd be just about like that.
Right. Yeah, he was one of my favorite race drivers when I was a kid growing up. I just kind of liked him. He had that persona about him. And that's going to be another program here in the near future that we're going to have is on racing. Sir, in your experiences, what is your favorite civilian aircraft to pilot?
Well, I got to fly Ralph Rogers Asphalt Company's Citation around for a few years, and that's a fun plane. It's like a civilian T-38 or just a bigger Aztec or
Now, that's
something.
the Cessna Citation, sir?
Cessna Citation, and it's easy to fly, and it'll carry 8 people, and it'll go fast, and
Is that a twin-engine jet?
twin-engine jet. Yeah.
Yes, sir.
That's probably my favorite. I like the Citation.
And what's the range on a Citation?
Well, if you 2,000 miles.
2,000 miles?
They make Citations. There's a whole range of Citations. The new Citation 10 can go over 7,000 miles.
So coast to coast without a problem.
London to New York without a problem, right. But I was flying the Citation 2s, and it had about a 2,000 mile range.
Okay. 2,000 mile range on a Citation. And where all did you fly to as a civilian pilot, sir? Any places
For
that
the
are...
Citation,
Yes, sir.
Mrs. Nelson was Ralph Rogers that had formed the Ralph Rogers Company, his daughter. And she owned Ralph Rogers Incorporated. She lived in Bloomington, and she was an active Republican. She got invited to the White House because she was the district chairman for Indiana, Illinois, Ohio. And she got invited to the White House to meet with the other district chairmen and to have luncheon with Nancy Reagan. So Gil Holt and I flew their Citation with Mrs. Nelson on the back to Washington, D.C., and she spent 2.5, 3 days hobnobbing at the White House while we just piddled around Washington, D.C. and had a good time. And then we took her to her house in Naples, Florida, and then came back to Bedford all in one. The trip home was all in one day. So that's kind of fun. You go to Washington, D.C., to Naples, Florida, and back to Bedford, and you did it after sunrise and before sunset.
The speed is about what? What do you fly at?
It's doing about 350.
350?
Yeah. Maybe closer to 400 if you push it a little bit. Yeah. But you can cover a lot of miles if you just sit there.
Yeah, you just sit there and run around. RB-50. Our B-17's made about 150 to 175.
My Aztec cruises at 160.
Is that right?
160 knots. And it covers a lot of ground, but it feels slow compared to the jets. The jets do twice that. It's just...
Now, sir, for our viewers, could you explain the breakdown between knots and miles per hour?
A nautical mile is 6,000 feet. A statute mile per hour is 5,280. So 1.15. If I'm wanting to know, if I'm doing 200 nautical miles per hour, how fast am I going in statute? 1.15, I'm doing 230 miles per hour.
Okay.
200 knots, 230 miles per hour.
So when I first started following aviation, that was kind of a problem. I couldn't figure out the difference.
Well, and then
I finally come up with it, but just for our audience that's listening.
Back in the 70s, they tried to change all the signs on the roads to kilometers. And that screwed everybody's mind over pretty good, because a kilometer is a whole different set of measurements than miles, statute miles, British statutes.
Correct.
That doesn't have anything to do with knots, though. That's different yet.
Yes. I've driven on the Autobahn in Germany as well.
Yeah, one of the benefits of old age, living in the same community, is that I'm sitting here talking to you, but I worked a year with your dad there at the Times Mail, and watch you grow up, basically, and through the high school. And now here we sit in 2013 still talking.
It's kind of fun.
I consider myself fortunate.
One of the big reasons I wanted to come back to Bedford, I was on active duty Air Force, and there was no way I could stay active duty Air Force and be back in Bedford, but this was home. And now that I'm home, I go to Walmart and I see people from my high school class, and the one before and the one after, and the people I grew up with at the newspaper, Every evening I was up at the newspapers talking to Dad and running around there. I knew all those people pretty well.
There's a great benefit to finding home at home.
Yeah.
So many people can't wait to get away, but
Right.
I think, I mean, Uncle Sam taught me that lesson. I was gone for 2.5 years, so if I got home, I wanted to stay home.
Yeah. I was gone for 8 active duty, and I felt like I was really getting home when I got here. Started driving to Bloomington to law school and coming back.
Well, did you ever fly back to visit while you were a pilot? Or was that just something that the Air Force wouldn't allow?
Well, I flew back to Grissom from Arizona a couple of times to talk to them about doing a Palace Chase switch over to the reserves and flying the A-37s. So I got to fly the T-37s from Arizona up here to Indiana and talk to them about flying A-37s. My dad was flying his Comanche all the time, and he flew to Arizona and saw me several times. I flew back home with him, made several trips doing that. So yeah, I got to come home a lot from the Air Force. It wasn't very often on the Air Force's dollar. Usually I had to pay for Dad's fuel for his plane, and we'd fly that way. But
Well, that's really interesting. And sir, it's been a real pleasure having you here on the Indiana History Project. And do you have anything else you'd like to talk about before we close?
well, I appreciate you letting me talk about flying. Pilots usually can be twisted their arms and they'll talk about flying about any time. Bedford's got a good airport. The community needs to be aware of how productive that is and how many people fly in and out of here on business stuff, and looking at the area for GM and for the U.S. Gypsum and for the Lehigh Cement. There's a lot of business activity comes through the Bedford Airport, and we really need to keep that as an asset to the community. It has been for a long time and will be for a long time, I think.
Just a little information for our viewers. If you do go to flightaware.com to look at the aircraft that are passing over the area, the airport code that you want to enter is KBFR for the Bedford Airport. Colonel Kern, I want to thank you very much for being here with us on the Indiana History Project.
Thank you.
On behalf of my co-host, Lee Hutchinson, I want to remind everyone that freedom isn't free. If you love your freedom, thank a veteran. And be sure to like us on Facebook, and thank you, everyone, for tuning in and making the Indiana History Project a success. So long, everyone.